December 12, 1944. A German woman drops to her knees in the frozen mud of a Pennsylvania field and weeps over a bowl of tomato soup. Not from sadness, not from pain, from shock. Because that single bowl of soup, cheap, simple, ordinary American tomato soup, had just destroyed everything she believed about the war, about America, about her own country, and about who was going to win. Her name was Liesl Brandt. She was 22 years old. 6 weeks ago, she had been a communications specialist for the German military in occupied France. Now she was a prisoner of war on enemy soil, holding a bowl of hot food that her own people hadn't seen in 2 years. And she was about to realize something that would change her life forever. But to understand why a bowl of soup could break a trained soldier, you first have to understand what hunger really means. Not the kind you feel when lunch runs late. The kind that follows you into sleep. The kind that makes children cry, not from fear of bombs, but from the pain of an empty stomach. By late 1944, that hunger had become the unofficial uniform of the German home front, and every woman in that transport truck knew exactly what it felt like. The truck had been moving for 3 days since their arrival in New York. 23 German women captured across different points on the Western Front packed together in the bitter cold. No one spoke much. There was nothing to say. The war was over for them. The only question was, what came next? Liesl sat near the back, watching the American landscape roll past through a gap in the canvas. She had expected ruins. She had been told America was strained, stretched thin by the demands of a two-front war, that its cities were suffering just like Germany's. But what she saw was impossible to reconcile with that story. Gas stations, lit storefronts, trucks loaded with goods moving freely down open roads. Not a single bombed building. Not one crater. Not one line of hollow-eyed civilians waiting for a rationed slice of bread. She said nothing, but she filed it away. The compound outside rural Pennsylvania was modest, clean, functional. Guards stood at the perimeter, but they didn't shout. They didn't strike. When Sergeant Rosa Martinez, a dark-haired woman with a Texas drawl that their translator Waltraud Becker struggled heroically to interpret, conducted the processing. She moved through it with the quiet efficiency of someone doing a job, not performing dominance. Fingerprints. Paperwork. A medical check with curtains drawn for privacy. Liesl had been braced for humiliation. The propaganda had been specific about American cruelty. She had mentally prepared herself for the worst. Instead, a curtain. For privacy. She didn't know what to do with that. But it was the mess hall that finished her. The smell hit first. Rich, warm, layered the smell of actual food. Real food that hadn't been stretched or substituted or diluted into something that only resembled what it was supposed to be. Liesl's legs went unsteady. Around her she could see the same thing happening to the other women. Greta Volkmann, the medical auxiliary from Bremen, pressed her lips together hard. Anneliese Schroeder, 20 years old and terrified, grabbed Liesl's arm without thinking. Private Thomas O'Brien stood behind the serving counter with red hair and an easy smile, and he ladled tomato soup into bowls like it cost him nothing. Because it did. Because here it did. He placed crackers on the plates. He added bread, real bread still steaming, and butter, and poured milk into glasses without measuring. Without checking a ration book. Without the careful, desperate arithmetic that had governed every meal in Germany for the past 2 years, Liesl accepted her tray. Her hands were trembling. She stared at the bowl, at the crackers, at the bread and butter, and the glass of cold milk beside it. Corporal David Stein appeared at her elbow, speaking through Waltraud's translation with a calm that seemed almost surreal. "This is your dinner. There's more if you want seconds." Nobody moved. 23 women stood in a mess hall holding trays of food, and not one of them could lift a spoon. Because you don't understand what that moment cost them to process, unless you understand Greta's spring of 1943 in Bremen, when the rations were cut for the 4th time in 6 months, and breakfast became a thin slice of dark bread with a chemical-tasting scrape of margarine, and lunch became turnip water, and dinner was more bread, and maybe a portion of processed sausage that contained more filler than meat. Greta had watched patients in her hospital ward deteriorate, not from their wounds, but from malnutrition. She had watched children with swollen bellies stare at walls. She had felt her own body begin to consume itself, her hair thinning her strength quietly, leaving her like water from a cracked vessel. You don't understand it unless you know about Hilda Meyer, the radio operator from Lübeck, who had monitored communications on long shifts while her concentration failed because her body was simply running out of fuel. Her mother's letters described the black market in clinical terms: one egg costing a week's wages, bread cut with sawdust, coffee made from acorns. By the time Hilda deployed to France, she weighed 15 kilograms less than she had 2 years before. And you don't understand it unless you know Liesel's Hamburg. The bombing had destroyed not just buildings, but the entire infrastructure of food distribution. Warehouses burned, rail lines were cratered. The port was a graveyard of twisted metal. She had stood in queue for 4 hours for a ration of potatoes, half of them rotten. She had watched her younger sister cry, not from the air raids, not from the noise and the fire, but from hunger. She had watched her mother's face age a decade in a single year as she quietly gave away her own portions so her children might eat. These women had not been idle civilians who sat out the war in comfort and convenience. They had served, sacrificed, believed. They had accepted the hunger as their contribution, as necessary, as the price of eventual victory. And now, here was Private O'Brien offering seconds. Hilda was the first to speak. Her voice was barely audible. In Lübeck, my mother's ration was 1 egg per month. She looked at her plate. 2 eggs for breakfast. She would find that out the next morning, but the soup alone had already told her everything she needed to know about the distance between what she had been told and what was actually true. Greta set down her fork. She couldn't eat yet. The math was overwhelming her. If this is what they feed prisoners, she thought, how do their own people eat? What kind of nation has so much that generosity to enemies is simply a default setting, an unremarkable Tuesday? It was Liesel who finally put it into words. We were told America was weak, soft, that they would collapse under pressure. But you cannot be weak and feed your prisoners better than your own nation feeds its soldiers. You cannot be soft and be winning this war. She paused. We were lied to about everything. The weight of it settled over the table like something physical. The next morning brought breakfast and broke them all over again. Oatmeal with brown sugar and raisins, toast, butter, jam, real coffee that filled the mess hall with an aroma that Liesel had nearly forgotten existed, and eggs scrambled generous, impossible portions. Waltraud Becker froze in the serving line, staring at her plate. 2 whole eggs, she whispered in German, just for breakfast. Over the following days, something began to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the silence at the German tables started to crack open at the edges. Sergeant Martinez answered questions about camp rules and prisoner rights under the Geneva Convention with brisk professionalism, no cruelty, no condescension. When Anneliese timidly asked about writing letters home, Martinez explained the process for censored correspondence and told her paper and pencils would be provided. Corporal Stein began sitting at their tables during his own meal breaks, talking through Waltraud about ordinary things. His family's delicatessen in Brooklyn, baseball, the difference between New York and Pennsylvania winters. Nothing political, nothing about the war. Just the unremarkable texture of an American life, which was in its own way more destabilizing than any interrogation could have been. O'Brien started teaching them English words as he served, turning the mess hall into an informal classroom. Mashed potatoes became a vocabulary lesson. Meatloaf became a cultural exchange. When he served corn on the cob and the German women stared at it in complete bewilderment, he demonstrated how to eat it. And for one brief moment, the mess hall filled with something that sounded almost like laughter. Captain Eleanor Wickham watched all of this from her position near the officers' table, with the expression of someone who understood exactly what was happening and had decided to let it happen. She was not running a rehabilitation program. She was simply running a camp where people were treated like people. The transformation was almost a side effect. Liesel noticed everything. She was trained to notice things. Patterns, signals, the gap between what was said and what was true. And what she was noticing, meal by meal, day by day, was a reality so fundamentally different from the one she had been taught that it required her to dismantle her entire understanding of the world and rebuild it from the ground up. This was only December. The hardest revelations hadn't come yet. By March, the newspapers would arrive. And everything that the soup had started, every quiet, careful crack in the wall of what they had believed would be blown open by photographs from places called Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, and Auschwitz. And Liesel Brandt would learn that the hunger she had endured, the sacrifice she had made, the cause she had served, had been cover for something she could not yet bring herself to imagine. But that is what comes next. In December 1944, 23 German women stepped off a transport truck in rural Pennsylvania and sat down to a dinner that shattered everything they believed about the war. Liesel Brandt, a 22-year-old communications specialist captured in France, stared at a bowl of tomato soup and realized with devastating clarity that her country had lied to her about everything. The food alone told the story. The abundance, the casual generosity the seconds offered without hesitation. But the soup was only the beginning, because in March of 1945, the newspapers arrived. And what came next would not break them gently. Captain Eleanor Wickham had run the Pennsylvania compound for 8 months. She had processed hundreds of prisoners. She understood that information handled correctly could accomplish what no interrogation ever could. When the first photographs from Bergen-Belsen reached American newsstands in late March, she made a decision that most commanders in her position would have avoided entirely. She made the materials available to the German prisoners. No order, no ceremony, no forced assembly. She simply placed the newspapers and magazines in the camp library and let the women find them on their own terms. Liesel found them on a Tuesday afternoon. She had been practicing English vocabulary at one of the reading tables O'Brien had started teaching her words during meal service, and she had discovered she had a talent for languages that surprised even herself. The newspaper was folded on the adjacent chair, and she picked it up because the photograph on the front page stopped her cold. She couldn't parse it at first. The image was grainy, high contrast, and what she was seeing didn't resolve into anything her brain had a framework for. Then the caption registered. Then the numbers beneath the caption. Then the dateline, April 15th, 1945. Bergen-Belsen. British forces had arrived to find 60,000 prisoners, of whom 13,000 were already dead and lying unburied across the campgrounds. Those still living weighed on average less than 40 kilograms. Liesel sat very still for a long time. She turned the page, then the next. Then she found the magazine with the photographs from Buchenwald, and then the account from a war correspondent who had walked through Dachau 4 days after American forces liberated it, and who had written his report with the flat, careful precision of a man trying not to lose his mind while putting words on paper. She read all of it. Waltraud found her there an hour later. Tears moving silently down her face, in a way that didn't look like crying, looked more like a slow internal leak, as if something structural had given way. Waltraud's English was better than anyone else's in the group, and she picked up a newspaper and read it without translation, without Liesel having to explain what she was looking at. Her face went the color of chalk. "How did we not know?" Waltraud whispered. Liesel didn't answer immediately. She was staring at a photograph of American soldiers escorting German civilians from a nearby town through the gates of a liberated camp, forcing them to see it, to walk through it, to stand in the presence of what had been done within walking distance of their homes. The civilians' faces were a study in collapsing denial. "We knew," Liesel said finally. "We chose not to." She said it quietly, without drama, and that was what made it unbearable. Not an accusation. A reckoning. The disappeared neighbors no one asked about. The trains that moved through the night carrying passengers who never sent letters home. The whispered rumors dismissed as enemy propaganda because believing them required action, and action required courage that none of them had summoned. Greta arrived next. Then Hilda, then Annalise, drawn by the word, moving quietly through the barracks, that something significant was happening in the library. They gathered around the tables and read passing newspapers and magazines between them without speaking. Greta, who had taken a medical oath, found the accounts of the experimental procedures conducted at Ravensbrück and had to leave the room twice before she could return and keep reading. She came back both times. She felt she owed the dead that much. Hilda read about Lublin Majdanek in complete silence, then set down the magazine and stared at the wall for several minutes. "I was a radio operator," she said to no one in particular. "I monitored communications. I heard things. Incomplete things. I told myself they were garbled, mistranslated." She stopped. "I knew what the words meant. I speak very clear German." Annalise sat with a magazine open in her lap and didn't turn the pages for a long time. She was 20 years old. She had joined the Auxiliary Corps because it was expected, because everyone around her was serving, because the machinery of the state had made refusal feel like an act requiring a kind of courage she hadn't understood she lacked. Now she sat in an American library in Pennsylvania, looking at photographs from Auschwitz and understanding for the first time the full weight of the structure she had participated in. "We are those people," she said, pointing to the photograph of the German civilians being walked through the liberated camp. "We are exactly those people." Nobody disagreed. Corporal Stein had been watching from the doorway for several minutes before Liesel noticed him. He was a Jewish American from Brooklyn whose grandparents had fled pogroms in Eastern Europe. He had cousins who had remained in Europe. He did not yet know in March of 1945 exactly what had happened to them. That knowledge would come later, and it would cost him years of his life to carry it. But he knew enough. He had known enough for a long time. He carried 2 cups of coffee and placed them on the table near Liesel without saying anything. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down. The silence between them lasted a full minute. "Corporal Stein," Liesel said finally in the careful English she had been assembling word by word over 3 months. "I want to ask you something. Is there a path for people like us? People who served this, who didn't stop it?" She searched for the word. "Redemption. Is there redemption for that?" Stein looked at her for a long moment. He was thinking about his cousins. He was thinking about what it would cost him to answer honestly, rather than with the full weight of his grief. "I can't give you that," he said. "That's not mine to give." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "But I can tell you this. You know what you know now. What you do next, that's who you actually are." He stood up, nodded once, and left them with their newspapers and their coffee and the wreckage of everything they had understood themselves to be. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Liesel's life. The war in Europe ended on May 8th, and the mess hall filled with American voices, celebrating restrained because many of them still had brothers in the Pacific. But genuine deep, the relief of people who had been carrying enormous weight for a very long time. The German women sat at their tables and listened to the celebration of their country's defeat, and not one of them felt anything like grief. What they felt was more complicated than grief. It was the particular exhaustion of people who had dismantled their own belief systems piece by piece over 5 months, and now had to decide what to build in the space those beliefs had occupied. Repatriation orders arrived in June. Captain Wickham called a meeting to explain the process, expected resignation, or perhaps quiet relief. Instead, Liesel stood up. She stood in the camp office with Greta and Waltraud flanking her, Hilda and Anneliese and Irmgard waiting in the hall, and she spoke in English that was no longer halting. "Captain Wickham, we have discussed this among ourselves for several weeks. Some of us wish to ask whether there is any possibility of remaining in America rather than returning to Germany." Wickham looked at her for a long moment. "Explain," she said. "Germany is destroyed," Liesel said. "Our cities are ruins. Our families are scattered. But more than the physical destruction, Germany represents something now that we cannot be part of without reckoning with what we allowed to happen inside it. We want to reckon with it. But some of us believe we can do that here and build something honest rather than returning to rubble and beginning again under the weight of everything we now know." She paused. "We are asking for a second chance. We understand we have not earned it. We are asking anyway." Wickham was silent for a long time. Outside the window, the Pennsylvania spring was advancing toward summer. Somewhere in the mess hall, O'Brien was setting up for dinner. The smell of roasting chicken was drifting across the compound, something he was preparing without any particular occasion in mind, simply because the kitchen had chicken, and he knew how to cook it. The abundance so ordinary, it had become invisible. The generosity so routine, it required no ceremony. Liesel waited. And somewhere in Washington, bureaucrats who had never met any of these women were about to make decisions that would determine the rest of their lives. Whether America had room for the people who had served its enemies, that question had no easy answer. But 6 women in a Pennsylvania camp had just made it impossible to ignore. The answer, when it came, would surprise everyone. 6 German women walked into a Pennsylvania mess hall in December 1944 and discovered that everything their government had told them was a lie. The tomato soup proved it. The eggs confirmed it. And the newspapers from March 1945, the photographs from Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Auschwitz, finished the work that abundance had started. By June, Liesel Brandt was standing in Captain Wickham's office, asking for something no German prisoner had ever requested: permission to stay. The bureaucrats in Washington were deliberating. The answer hadn't come yet. But while they waited, the world outside the Pennsylvania compound was changing at a speed that made deliberation feel almost absurd. The war in Europe was over. The war in the Pacific was not. And in the summer of 1945, the full machinery of American military production, the same machinery whose output had staggered 23 German women at a serving counter, was turning its complete attention toward Japan, with a focus that had no precedent in the history of warfare. The German women followed the Pacific news through camp newspapers with a complicated attention. They were enemy prisoners of a nation now engaged in a different war, entirely processing their own defeat while watching America accelerate toward another. The contrast was clarifying in ways that no lecture could have achieved. Every report from the Pacific Theater underscored the same reality the soup had communicated in December. America was not a nation running on fumes. It was a nation running on surplus, on industrial scale, on a productive capacity so vast that it could fight on two hemispheres simultaneously and still feed its prisoners better than Germany fed its soldiers. The numbers were not abstract. They arrived in the newspapers with the flat authority of fact. In the first 6 months of 1945, American aircraft production exceeded 60,000 planes. Shipyards that had been converted from civilian to military use were launching vessels at rates that German naval planners had calculated as mathematically impossible. The logistics chain stretching from American factories to Pacific Island chains represented an organizational achievement that had no parallel in the history of military conflict. Hilda read these reports with the particular attention of someone who had spent 2 years monitoring communications. She had been trained to extract signal from noise to identify patterns in incomplete information. What the patterns told her now was unambiguous. Germany lost this war in 1942, she said one evening, setting down a newspaper with the careful precision of someone placing a fragile object on a surface. The moment America entered with full production, we lost then. Everything after that was just the dying. Nobody at the table disagreed. The question of the 6 women's futures was resolved in early July through a legal framework that Captain Wickham had spent 3 weeks navigating through Washington channels. The Geneva Convention required repatriation. It did not prevent voluntary displaced person applications, provided that American sponsors could be secured and that the women in question could demonstrate they posed no security risk. The pathway existed. It was narrow, procedurally complex, and entirely dependent on Americans being willing to vouch for former enemy nationals. What happened next was the part of the story that Laisselle would spend the rest of her life trying to explain to people who hadn't been there. Private O'Brien volunteered his family in Harrisburg without hesitation. His parents owned a bakery. They could provide housing employment a foothold. He stood in Wickham's office with the straightforward confidence of someone who had spent 8 months working alongside these women and had arrived at conclusions that rendered nationality largely irrelevant. "My family came from Ireland with nothing," he said. "They didn't speak English either." Corporal Stein's contribution was the one that landed differently. He sat across from Waltraud Becker, the translator, the woman who had served as the linguistic bridge between two worlds in collision, and offered to connect her with his uncle's business in Philadelphia, which needed translators for European trade operations. He made the offer quietly without ceremony, and Waltraud understood what it cost him. His grief was not hidden. He had not pretended across 8 months that his feelings about German prisoners were uncomplicated. The offer came from somewhere beyond complication. It came from a decision that forgiveness, or something adjacent to it, was more useful than its alternative. Waltraud accepted. She could not find words adequate to the moment, so she simply said, "Thank you" in English, which she rarely did. She usually defaulted to German, even when she had the English available. The choice of language was not accidental. Sergeant Martinez knew farming families in Texas who might sponsor workers. Mrs. Eleanor Henderson, a schoolteacher from Gettysburg, who had been running English classes at the camp through a church outreach program, arrived at Wickham's office with a formal sponsorship offer for Laisselle housing potential employment teaching German language at the local school, a place inside a family rather than on the margins of one. 3 women accepted sponsorship and began the displaced persons process. Laisselle Greta Waltraud. 3 women chose to return. Annalise had received word through the Red Cross that her mother was alive in the British occupation zone. The news arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, and Annalise read the Red Cross notification 3 times before she could absorb it. Her mother was alive. That fact reorganized everything. Family obligation did not cancel moral reckoning, it redirected it. She would go home. She would face Germany's ruins and her mother's face, and the weight of everything she now knew. She would do that reckoning on German soil, which perhaps was where it belonged. Hilda's reasoning was different, and Laisselle thought the most demanding of the 3. "I contributed to this," Hilda said simply, when they talked it through in the barracks on their last night together. "Not to the camps, I didn't know the full extent, I genuinely didn't. But to the structure that made the camps possible. I was inside that structure. I operated it." She folded her hands on the bunk frame. "I think I have to go back and be part of what comes after. Rebuilding. Reckoning. I don't think I get to leave that to other people. Irmgard had spent the previous 3 months working in the camp's Displaced Persons Processing Office, helping to manage paperwork for European refugees passing through. She had found in that work something that felt like the beginning of an answer to the question Corporal Stein had posed. What you do next defines who you actually are. She would return to Germany, work in similar offices there, and eventually immigrate to Israel in 1954. The arc of her life would bend entirely toward the people her country had tried to destroy. She never claimed it was sufficient. She believed it was necessary. The final dinner was June 28, 1945. O'Brien produced roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, bread, and apple pie that caused Greta to cry quietly into her napkin in a way she didn't try to hide or explain. Captain Wickham stood and offered a toast with apple cider. Her voice was steady. "I have commanded this facility for 8 months," she said. "I have overseen the processing of several hundred prisoners. What happened in this compound this winter and spring, I don't have a military term for it. I'm not sure there is one." She raised her glass. "To what comes next?" They drank. The conversation that followed was the most honest Lae'zel had participated in since before the war. They talked about fear, the fear of returning, the fear of starting over, the fear of what they would find when they looked at their own histories without the protection of ideology. They talked about the specific texture of shame which none of them had been prepared for, and all of them were learning to carry. They talked about the Americans at the table with them, O'Brien, Stein, Martinez, Wickham, as people rather than representatives of a nation, which was the most fundamental shift the past 7 months had produced. Stein said something near the end of the evening that Lae'zel wrote down afterward in the journal she had started keeping in January. He said, "The opposite of hate isn't love, it's recognition. Seeing someone as an actual person instead of what you need them to represent." He said it without particular emphasis, the way people say things they have thought about long enough that the weight of the thought has become familiar. Lae'zel wrote it down anyway. She would read it again 25 years later in her kitchen in Gettysburg, stirring tomato soup for her daughter's school lunch, and it would still be true. The transport for the returning women left on July 3rd. Lae'zel stood at the compound fence and watched the truck move down the road until it disappeared. She stood there for a while after it was gone. Behind her, Mrs. Henderson was waiting with a car and a spare bedroom and a teaching position that would start in September. Ahead of her, by any reasonable measure, was everything. She turned around. The compound looked different from this side of the decision. Smaller, more ordinary, a collection of buildings in rural Pennsylvania that had been for 7 months the site of the most significant education of her life. A bowl of soup had started it. Photographs had deepened it. A Jewish American from Brooklyn had, through a single act of practical generosity, demonstrated something about forgiveness that no speech could have taught. She picked up her small case and walked toward the car. 25 years later, the 6 women would meet again in New York City. They would discover that each of them in her own way had spent the intervening decades doing the same thing, trying to answer the question Corporal Stein had posed in a Pennsylvania library in March of 1945. What you do next defines who you actually are. They had all in the end chosen to answer it. In December 1944, 23 German women discovered that a bowl of tomato soup could dismantle a worldview. Over the following 7 months, they confronted abundance atrocity and the question of what a person owes to the truth once she can no longer claim ignorance. 3 women chose to stay in America. 3 chose to return to Germany. All 6 chose in their different ways to spend the rest of their lives answering Corporal Stein's question. What you do next defines who you actually are. This is what came next. Liesl Brandt married Robert Henderson in 1948, 3 years after stepping off a transport truck in rural Pennsylvania with nothing but a thin coat and the wreckage of everything she had believed. She became a naturalized American citizen, taught German language at a Gettysburg school for 22 years, and raised 3 children who spoke both languages without accent in either. She never lost her own accent. She stopped trying to around 1952 when she realized it was useful. It reminded her students and herself that language carries history in its mouth. She made tomato soup every year on December 12th. Not as performance, as private reckoning. The soup cost almost nothing and tasted like the moment her life divided into before and after, and she believed that forgetting the division would be its own kind of betrayal. Greta Volkmann completed nursing training in Pennsylvania, returned to Germany in 1952, as part of a medical exchange program and spent the next 3 decades rebuilding hospital systems in a country that had perverted medicine into something she still couldn't fully name without her hands shaking. She corresponded with American colleagues until she died in 1989, the year the Berlin Wall fell, which she lived to see from a hospital window in Hamburg. She had wanted to see it. She had waited for it with the patience of someone who understood that historical reckonings move slowly and arrive anyway. Waltraud Becker became exactly what Corporal Stein had imagined when he made his offer a bridge. Her translation work expanded into cultural consultation, then into a small firm advising American companies navigating the complexities of post-war Germany's Reconstruction economy. She built something real from the opportunity a Jewish American had extended across the widest possible distance of grief and history. She never forgot what that cost him to offer. In a 1971 interview, she said, "David Stein taught me that generosity is not the absence of pain, it is the decision to act despite it." Stein himself had gone back to Brooklyn after the war, taken over his family's delicatessen, and eventually expanded it into a small chain of 3 locations. He lost 2 cousins in the camps. Confirmation came in 1946 through survivor testimonies and Red Cross documentation. He carried that loss the way people carry losses that have no adequate response, which is to say, continuously and without resolution. He maintained correspondence with Waltraud for 40 years. He attended the 1970 reunion in New York, shook hands with women he had once watched weep over tomato soup, and said very little. He had learned by then that presence was often more honest than speech. Anneliese Schroeder found her mother alive and diminished in the British occupation zone, living in 2 rooms of what had been a 4-bedroom apartment, the other rooms having been allocated to displaced families. They did not speak for several days after Anneliese arrived, not from estrangement, but from the particular exhaustion of people who have survived things they cannot yet narrate. Anneliese eventually became a teacher specializing in civic education, which in post-war Germany meant teaching young people to ask the questions that her generation had failed to ask. She taught for 31 years and considered it the most important work she ever did. Hilda Meyer did exactly what she had promised. She returned to Germany and stayed working first in Reconstruction administration, then in early denazification programs, then in historical documentation projects that required her to read, organize, and preserve accounts of things she would rather not have read. She did it anyway because she believed, and said so explicitly in a 1965 memoir, that the historical record was a form of moral obligation, that allowing atrocity to become vague was its own participation in atrocity. Irmgard Peterson's trajectory was the most extreme translation of the question Stein had posed. She returned to Germany, worked in displaced persons camps, helping refugees navigate bureaucratic systems that seemed designed to exhaust rather than assist, and in 1954, to see the person in front of you as a person. Here is what most accounts of this period miss. In 1970, when the 6 women gathered in New York, Corporal Stein brought a document he had requested through the National Archives. It was Captain Wickham's original assessment report from January 1945, written 6 weeks after the German women arrived, classifying their psychological status and security risk for Washington Review. The report was thorough, professionally written, and entirely routine in its form. But in the final paragraph, Wickham had written something that was not routine. She had written, "These prisoners present no security concern. They are rather an opportunity not for intelligence extraction, but for a different kind of demonstration. If we treat them as we would wish our own prisoners to be treated, we will learn something about what we are capable of. If we do not, we will learn something different. I recommend the former." Washington had filed the report without comment. Nobody had told her to write that paragraph. Nobody had authorized the philosophy it contained. Wickham had looked at 23 cold, frightened women climbing off a truck in rural Pennsylvania and had decided on her own authority that how you treat people when you have absolute power over them is the truest measure of what you actually believe about human dignity. She retired from the Army in 1952 as a lieutenant colonel. She never wrote a memoir. She gave one interview in 1967 to a researcher studying prisoner of war administration, and said almost nothing about the Pennsylvania compound. When the researcher asked whether she considered her approach to prisoner management successful, she paused for a long moment and then said, "I considered it correct. Whether it was successful is a question for the people who lived there." Liesl Brandt Henderson was 73 years old when she was diagnosed with the illness that would end her life. Her daughter Sarah, by then a history professor at Georgetown, sat with her through the final weeks and recorded their conversations with a small tape recorder that her mother accepted with amused tolerance. In those recordings, Lae'zel returned again and again to December 1944, to the mess hall, to the bowl of soup. "People ask me what changed me," she said in one recording, her accent still present after 50 years of American life. "They expect me to say the photographs, the newspapers, the concentration camps." She paused. "Those broke me open, but the soup is what got in." She meant that atrocity documented and irrefutable had destroyed her ideology. But it had been the ordinary generosity. The extra apples, the 2 eggs at breakfast, the curtain drawn for privacy during a medical exam, that had built something in the space where the ideology had been. Something that looked like a different way of understanding what people owe each other. Then in early denazification programs, then in historical documentation projects that required her to read, organize, and preserve accounts of things she would rather not have read. She did it anyway because she believed, and said so explicitly in a 1965 memoir, that the historical record was a form of moral obligation, that allowing atrocity to become vague was its own participation in atrocity. Irmgard Peterson's trajectory was the most extreme translation of the question Stein had posed. She returned to Germany, worked in displaced persons camps, helping refugees navigate bureaucratic systems that seemed designed to exhaust rather than assist, and in 1954 immigrated to Israel. She spent the remainder of her working life in social services organizations supporting Holocaust survivors. She never claimed this was sufficient. She said once in a letter to Lae'zel that she had stopped asking whether her work was enough and started asking whether she was doing it well, because the first question had no answer and the second one was actionable. The 6 women who had eaten tomato soup together in a Pennsylvania mess hall had become collectively something that no military program had designed and no policy had anticipated. They had become evidence. Evidence that the distance between enemy and human being was traversable, given time and basic decency, and enough honest information. Evidence that transformation was possible even in people shaped by systems built specifically to prevent it. The 1970 reunion in New York lasted 3 days. They met at a hotel in Manhattan, 6 women between the ages of 48 and 54, and they talked with the directness of people who have nothing left to perform for each other. They compared notes on their lives, on the unexpected shapes their decisions had taken, on what they had learned about guilt and responsibility, and the specific texture of living with knowledge you cannot unknow. On the second evening, Lae'zel produced a photograph she had kept for 25 years. It was a snapshot taken by Corporal Stein with a personal camera in the spring of 1945. 6 German women and 4 American military personnel sitting at a mess hall table, not posed. Just present, captured in the middle of whatever conversation they had been having. Everyone in the photograph looked like a person, which sounds like a small thing, and was not. They passed it around the table. Waltraud held it for a long time. "We look like people who have just realized something," she said. "We were," Lae'zel said. What the Pennsylvania compound had demonstrated, without designing itself as a demonstration, was something that military historians and policy analysts would spend decades discussing, in terms that made it sound more systematic than it had been. The reality was simpler. Captain Wickham had run a camp where people were treated with basic professional decency. Private O'Brien had offered apples because the kitchen had extra fruit. From a mess hall in rural Pennsylvania, to 3 American lives built from the ruins of 3 German ones, to 6 women who spent their decades trying to answer a question posed by a man from Brooklyn who had every reason not to ask it. Gently, this story is about what it costs to treat an enemy as a human being, and what it produces. It costs almost nothing. A bowl of soup, an extra apple, a curtain. What it produces is harder to quantify. But Lae'zel Brandt Henderson sat in her kitchen in Gettysburg for 40 years, making tomato soup on December 12th, and watching her children grow up in a country that had once been generous to their mother, when it had no obligation to be, and she considered the exchange more than fair. The greatest weapon the Pennsylvania compound deployed was not information, not interrogation, not psychological strategy. It was the decision made daily by ordinary people with ordinary authority to behave as if the person in front of them deserved to be treated well. History records the wars. It rarely records the mess halls. But sometimes the mess hall is where the war actually ends. If you know a story like this one, a moment where decency changed something that force could not, share it in the comments. These stories exist in every conflict in every generation, and most of them are never told. Subscribe to find more of the ones that were. The enemy you treat as a human being may spend the rest of her life proving that you were right to do so.